As you know, my lady, I appear for Southall Black Sisters and Solace Women's Aid, together with Marina Surjadis, Fatima Jishi, Ubadiri and Angharab Monk, and we're instructed by Public Interest Law Centre. My lady, we know that there was a rise in domestic abuse in 2020, and we know that rise was foreseen and was a direct result of the MPIs implemented by government. So the issue is not what the government did, but what it failed to do and what it could and should have done to make a material difference to victims, predominantly women, experiencing domestic abuse. We say there were 5 main failures. A failure to be prepared well in advance of the first lockdown, a failure to get the messaging right despite requests, a failure to consider, let alone implement, an exception to the regulations that would have allowed people to provide a safe place to those fleeing domestic abuse, a failure to ensure that all victims of domestic abuse had access to support when the government refused to suspend no recourse to public funds, and a failure to learn lessons from the first lockdown when it came to the second and third lockdown. In terms of what was done, namely funding to frontline services and holding the Hidden Harms Summit, we say that this was too little and too late. Whilst the You Are Not Alone campaign by the Home Office was a welcome move, it was late, relatively short-lived, and without parallel messaging from the whole of government, its impact was lost. Underlying all these failures, we say, was a failure to consult early on with the domestic abuse sector as to what they needed. My lady, the background to these failures is a culture of either indifference or, as you have heard, misogyny at the very heart of government. But that in itself, while shocking and leading to narrow decision-making, is not a sufficient explanation. Government as a whole has responsibility for tackling domestic abuse. That responsibility lies primarily with the Home Office, but also with what was then the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, MHCLG, and the Ministry of Justice. None of those departments anticipated the rise in domestic abuse or the need to plan for it. They all reacted too late. And that shows a lack of attention to domestic abuse and indifference to domestic abuse at a corporate level, not solely explained by the misogyny and indifference which we've seen from central senior decision makers. It is an institutional failure which led to many women facing 2 risks to their health, from COVID and from domestic abuse. And indeed, in the case of women subject to no recourse to public funds, 3 risks because they also face destitution. We say that for future pandemics, government must consult at an early stage with the domestic abuse sector and must include domestic abuse in its pandemic planning. My lady, you heard oral testimony from Rebecca Goshawk from Solace Women's Aid, and you have written evidence from her and from Hanana Siddiqui from Southall Black Sisters. Some personal accounts from women are contained in the 2 witness statements and in the aptly named report exhibited in the witness statements from Solace Women's Aid. When I needed you to protect me, you gave him more power instead. Let me read just 2 of those accounts of what life was like in the double prison of lockdown and of domestic abuse. Raina, whose story is in Hanana Siddiqui's witness statement, says, "It was most horrible at the time. I was always inside the house. He never let me go to the park for a walk. He did leave the house to go for a walk. I was 24/7 inside the house, confined to my room. Even using the washroom and kitchen was a task for me. I took one of my kids in the kitchen so I could cook in peace," pausing because otherwise she would have been abused while cooking. "I didn't have a choice for the whole of COVID. I was only confined to my room. I became mute. I was so depressed and I didn't feel like talking. There were constant fights because of him being around all the time. It made me so anxious. I was living in a nightmare without end. COVID for me was a nightmare." He refused to let her use her phone. And to emphasise the triple abuse experienced by women who are migrants, all my documents are with him. Till date, my passport and everything is with him, me and my sons. He hasn't given them to us. The second account is in When I Needed You to Protect Me, and makes the point that abuse increased partly because of the physical restriction of lockdown, but also because abusers turned their fear of the virus against women. When the Covid-19 pandemic began, her perpetrator insisted on her isolating in her room for a week after being outside of the house for mere minutes. Later, he assaulted me to get me out of the kitchen because he didn't want me to be around the food that he'd just cooked. I told him how scared I was. He didn't care, you know, he just saw me as an object. We know from Goshawk and Siddiqui and the documents they produce, including the call for evidence from another 12 domestic abuse organisations exhibited to Siddiqui's statement, that there was an extraordinary increase in demand for domestic abuse services, that traditional methods to find support, such as speaking privately with GPs at medical appointments, were not available. There was not the school support or social worker visiting. It was difficult to access statutory services, such as homelessness or social services. And of course, women could not stay with or even visit family or friends. We also know that the nature of domestic abuse worsened during lockdown. More women reported the use of weapons, including knives. Women described being locked in bathrooms or bedrooms at home, as you've just heard. They described being prevented from using phones or computers to communicate. So they were cut off from their family and friends, something which is deeply controlling and in lockdown is deeply isolating. So lockdown was a lonely, frightening and dangerous experience. The domestic abuse sector was having to deal with the extra demand and the additional complexity of cases in circumstances where their funding had been substantially cut over the previous 10 years, leaving many of them operating on a shoestring, and with the most serious cuts made to the smaller providers, including the by and for providers, mainly those by and for black and ethnic minority women. Together, of course, with having to reorganise their service provision so that workers could work from home and could support their frontline workers who are managing their own health, households and their crucial work. My lady, the rise in domestic abuse and in the intensity of abuse experienced is still being witnessed and dealt with by the domestic abuse sector today. The impact of domestic abuse does not end when lockdown ends or even when the pandemic ends. Let me turn to the 5 failures. The first failure to be prepared in advance of the first lockdown. The evidence has shown that an increase in domestic abuse was not just foreseeable, but was actually foreseen once social isolation and lockdown were contemplated. You have that from accounts in the press from other countries, from Martin Hewitt's evidence that it was self-evident that lockdown was going to put vulnerable people at risk, and from Dame Jenny Harris, who was aware that women were calling helplines once lockdown was anticipated, even before it was implemented. We also know that government was warned. By mid-March, domestic abuse charities were campaigning about the risk of increase in domestic abuse. On the 19th of March, the Victims Commissioner and the Equality and Human Rights Commission both wrote to the Prime Minister, and the Domestic Abuse Commissioner wrote to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. They warned of the likely increase in domestic abuse and asked for increased funding to meet this anticipated surge in demand. And it seems to have been those letters, together with a more public campaign, that sparked the Home Office and MHCLG into some action. And we know that from 2 memos, which are the first documents referring to the need for government assistance, particularly funding and messaging. They're on the 25th of March within the MHCLG, and on the 26th of March, a memo from Home Office officials to the Home Secretary and the Minister for Safeguarding. So that's when government starts to plan. 2 to 3 days after full lockdown is announced and implemented. 10 days after social isolation is recommended on the 16th of March. A month from the 28th of February, when government departments are told to plan from the pandemic, or early March, when the scientists start to talk about suppression. You heard Dame Priti Patel's evidence that she and Martin Hewitt were regularly discussing domestic abuse from early March. That may be the case. We don't have the notes of those meetings. But if they were, the delay in not starting to formulate a plan until the 26th of March is even more concerning. Second failure, lack of consistent and clear messaging. Clarity of messaging is an important part of MPIs. Boris Johnson said messaging was the most important tool we had to deal with the virus. The regulations, including the exemptions to the stay-at-home requirement, needed to be clearly and consistently communicated. Very soon into lockdown, the domestic abuse sector was concerned that it was not clear that women at risk of domestic abuse could leave. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner made that point on the Today programme on the 31st of March. The Home Office took some steps. Dame Pretty wrote in the Mail on Sunday on the 29th of March. The You Are Not Alone campaign was launched on the 11th of April when Dame Pretty and Martin Hewitt did the daily press briefing at Downing Street. But we say that the message was not explicit enough. The guidance used the phrase from the regulations, escape risk of injury or harm, and did not specifically mention domestic abuse. We say it should have done and should also have made it clear that women leaving in those circumstances could take their children. Dame Jenny Harris said in evidence, "I'm not sure that if I was somebody frightened, in a domestic abuse situation and about to go into lockdown, that I would perhaps have clocked that the message that says for an emergency actually applied to me." We say the most egregious failure of messaging was the lack of consistency across government and notably in the Prime Minister's and Deputy Prime Minister's addresses to the nation when announcing lockdown or the continuation of lockdowns. My lady, you've heard that none of the Prime Minister's 4 addresses during 2020 announcing lockdown mentioned domestic abuse as a lawful reason to leave home. On the 23rd of March, he listed 4 exceptions, none referring to the risk of injury or harm. And he compounded that omission by saying, that's all. Those are the only reasons why you should leave your home. He finally mentioned domestic abuse on the 4th of January 2021, after an advisor had flagged up that afternoon that his speech should make it clear, saying we get kicked every time for not saying it. Dominic Raab's response, when asked why domestic abuse was not included, was that there was limited time. We say that is dismissive. An additional short sentence takes a couple of seconds. Boris Johnson, on the other hand, said that in retrospect, it probably should have been made explicit. Dame Priti Patel's evidence was that she and her department had raised the issue with Mr Johnson. He did not remember her raising it. In short, while messaging was developed by the Home Office, it was done so under pressure and was late. The regulations and guidance were not sufficiently clear, and government messaging, particularly the important addresses from the Prime Minister, was not consistent. The third failure, a gap in the regulations. Matt Hancock confirmed that the exemption to the requirement to stay at home, that a person could leave if they were victim of crime or at risk of injury or harm, was intended to include domestic abuse. We say that a parallel position, to which no thought was given, was equally necessary. That parallel position is for an exemption to permit friends or family to offer a person escaping abuse a temporary place to stay, an informal safe haven. My lady, you've heard our point that this is something that is normal. A sister or mother or friend offers a spare room or sofa. It was all the more necessary in lockdown given that refuges were at capacity and were turning women away. Hancock's evidence was that had such a proposal been put to him, he would have seriously considered it and would have been inclined to agree. We recognise that this proposal requires scientific advice, but we do suggest that for future pandemics, the opportunity of an individual providing a temporary place to stay to someone escaping abuse is at least considered. The fourth failure, not protecting migrant women subject to domestic abuse. You have the point, my lady, that those subject to no recourse to public funds who were being abused underwent a triple lock of domestic abuse, of lockdown, and of the structural barriers to leaving in the form of destitution. These women have no access to welfare benefits or housing and homelessness assistance. At a time of public health emergency, the humanitarian measure would have been to suspend NRPF, so that women fleeing domestic abuse could know that they would not be destitute. They could claim welfare benefits, have the opportunity of a refuge place, or obtain homelessness assistance from the council. Government was lobbied extensively to suspend NRPF during the pandemic, not just from the domestic abuse sector, but also from the Mayor of London, Labour and SNP MPs, the Domestic Abuse and Victims Commissioners, the Local Government Association and Liberty. Despite that, government took a clear policy decision not to suspend NRPF. Dame Priti's response when we asked her was to say that it was legally challenging to suspend and then to go back and reinstate. We say that government took several extraordinary steps in the pandemic for public health reasons, not least the everyone in instruction that all those sleeping rough should be given emergency accommodation regardless of immigration status. It cannot have been beyond government to take this step. Deciding not to suspend NRPF, we say, was not a legal decision, it was a political decision. It was part of the government's hostile environment, which it was not willing to compromise on, even during a public health emergency. Before I turn to the fifth failure, let me deal with the issue of funding for refugees and other domestic abuse support services. Government was extensively lobbied from the end of March and throughout April, not just by the domestic abuse sector, but also by the Domestic Abuse Commissioner, the Mayor of London, and others for additional funding. On the 27th of April, a month into lockdown, there were three significant events. The House of Commons Home Affairs Committee issued a devastating report on Home Office preparedness for coronavirus, domestic abuse and the risks of harm within the home. And I say that not to impeach or question it, but simply to refer to its publicly available contents. Public Interest Law Centre, acting on behalf of Southall Black Sisters and Solace Women's Aid, sent a letter before claim to the MHCLG threatening judicial review. And over 750 people sent emails to Priti Patel and Robert Jenrick. The Home Office had provided £2 million on the 11th of April when it launched its You Are Not Alone campaign. But more substantial funding was not announced until the 2nd of May, when £76 million was announced, of which £27 million was earmarked for the domestic abuse sector. We say that announcement was a direct result of campaigning by the domestic abuse sector, of the threat of legal action and of the Home Office Affairs Committee's report. We asked Dame Priti about that, particularly the threat of legal action, and she said she could not give a categorical response. We do note, and we'll give you details in our written submissions, of an MHCLG submission to the Minister on the 5th of May, which refers explicitly to the threat of judicial review. Even that money announced on the 2nd of May did not start to be allocated until the 19th of June and only came through around July. The point is, my lady, that although funding was requested before lockdown started from the 19th of March, it did not reach domestic abuse organisations during the first lockdown at all in March, April, May or June. And so those organisations, already chronically underfunded from 10 years of austerity cuts, spent the whole of the first lockdown struggling with unprecedented demand and insufficient resources. And I should add that domestic abuse workers were not automatically treated as key workers. They faced struggles for PPE, testing and even access to early vaccination. The fifth and final failure, my lady, is the failure to learn lessons from the first lockdown. Boris Johnson made a point in his witness statement of saying that lessons had been learned, specifically about domestic abuse and child abuse, and the government wanted to ensure that services supporting women and children remained available and steps were taken to tackle these crimes. When asked what steps were taken, he responded with the Ask for Annie scheme, which came into effect in February 2021, and the Domestic Abuse Bill. While what is now the Domestic Abuse Act is very welcome, it did not receive royal assent until April 2021 and only started to come into force from July 2021. And so it is not an answer to what steps were taken to protect women during the second and third lockdowns from the first lockdown. Lessons were not learned by government from the first lockdown. My lady, we will submit detailed recommendations for you in our written submissions, but we say that crucially, government failed to consult early on with the violence against women and girls sector, and that was a mistake that should not be repeated in the future. Above all, my lady, in another pandemic, victims of domestic abuse should not be left without support, isolated, lonely, frightened and abused. And preventing that abuse needs to be a government priority and not an afterthought. Thank you, my lady.